In July 1974, 22-year-old Melissa Torres left her shift at Woolworths in Corpus Christi, Texas, carrying a paper bag with her work shoes and the romance novel she'd been reading on breaks. She never made it to the bus stop 3 blocks away. Police found her purse near the loading dock, contents intact, but Melissa had vanished into the thick Gulf Coast humidity. For her mother Rosa, that summer stretched into 49 years of unanswered questions. Then, in 2023, a construction crew renovating an old warehouse discovered something buried beneath the concrete floor. DNA testing on evidence preserved in a forgotten evidence box revealed a match, but the identity would devastate everyone who remembered Melissa's bright smile and dreams of becoming a teacher. The killer had been part of the investigation from the very beginning, hiding in the last place anyone thought to look. What makes this case truly chilling isn't just the decades of deception, but how close the truth had been all along, preserved in a single photograph that everyone had seen, but no one had truly understood. Before we continue with Melissa's story, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel. Cases like hers stayed buried for nearly 5 decades, but your support helps ensure these voices are finally heard. The discovery. March 2023. The sledgehammer struck concrete with a sound that echoed through the empty warehouse like thunder. Dust rose in thick clouds, catching the morning sunlight that slanted through broken windows. Miguel Contreras wiped sweat from his forehead and squinted at the floor they'd been demolishing for the past 3 days. Something looked wrong beneath the fractured concrete. "Hey, Raul," Miguel called to his crew chief. "You need to see this." What they saw made Miguel step back, his hands suddenly shaking. Fabric, faded and brittle, bone white against the dark earth, the kind of discovery that stops construction projects and starts phone calls to police. By noon, the Corpus Christi Police Department's cold case unit had transformed the warehouse into a crime scene. Detective Carmen Ortiz stood at the edge of the excavation pit, watching the forensic team work with methodical precision. At 53, she'd worked enough cases to know that bones buried under concrete meant someone had worked very hard to keep secrets. The warehouse had been built in 1976, the contractor's permits showed. Whatever lay beneath that floor had been there before the foundation was poured. "Detective?" A young forensic technician climbed up from the pit, carefully holding an evidence bag. "We found this with the remains." Inside the bag, Ortiz could see a tarnished silver bracelet. 5 small charms dangled from it: a tiny book, a cross, a heart, a star, and what looked like a miniature schoolhouse. Ortiz's breath caught. She'd seen that bracelet before, in photographs yellowed with age, in a case file that had sat cold for decades. She pulled out her phone and scrolled through the digital archive she'd uploaded months ago, part of her personal project to review every unsolved disappearance in Corpus Christi, dating back to the 1970s. There, a black and white photo from July 1974. A young woman smiling at the camera, her dark hair pulled back, her left wrist clearly showing a distinctive silver bracelet. Melissa Torres, missing for 49 years, and now, finally, found. Summer 1974, the last day. The heat in Corpus Christi that July was vicious, the kind that made asphalt shimmer and turned car interiors into ovens by mid-morning. The air conditioning unit at Woolworths struggled against the Texas sun, producing more noise than cool air, but it was still better than the thick humidity outside. Melissa Torres wiped down the cosmetics counter for the 3rd time that afternoon, her movements automatic after 18 months of working the same station. At 22, she'd taken this job to save money for college, real college, not the community classes she'd been taking at night. She wanted to teach elementary school. wanted to be the kind of teacher she'd never had growing up in the barrio, where Spanish was spoken more than English, and dreams felt like luxuries. "You reading that romance trash again?" Lisa Martinez, another countergirl, grinned as she spotted the paperback Melissa had tucked beneath the register. The cover showed a woman in a flowing dress, a dark-haired man reaching for her against a sunset. Melissa laughed, feeling the familiar warmth in her cheeks. "It's not trash. It's aspirational." "It's trash," Lisa insisted, but fondly. "My shift ends in 5. Want to grab a Coke at Shelley's?" "Can't. Mama's making tamales tonight. I promised I'd help." Melissa glanced at the clock mounted above the pharmacy section. 5:47 p.m. 13 more minutes. At 5:52, a young girl wandered up to the counter, maybe 7 years old, her brown eyes wide with worry. She wore a faded yellow sundress and clutched a dollar bill in her small fist. "Excuse me," she whispered. "Do you have lipstick for $1?" Melissa knelt down so she was eye level with the girl. "Is it for your mama?" The girl nodded, looking at her worn sneakers. "It's her birthday tomorrow. I saved my allowance, but—" Her voice trailed off as she glanced at the display of lipsticks, all priced at $2.50 or more. Melissa felt something catch in her chest. She'd been that girl once, wanting desperately to give her mother something beautiful, something that said, "You matter, you're special," but having only coins saved from bottles returned to the store. "You know what?" Melissa said softly. "We have a special sale today. Birthday sale, for mamas only." She reached for a tube of Revlon Persian Melon, a beautiful coral shade that would look lovely on anyone. It was her own favorite, the one she wore to church on Sundays. $1 exact. The girl's face transformed, lit up like Christmas morning. "Really? Really?" Melissa took the crumpled dollar bill and pressed the lipstick into the girl's hands. "Tell your mama happy birthday from all of us at Woolworth's." "Thank you, thank you." The girl clutched the lipstick to her chest and ran toward the front of the store where her older sister waited. Lisa had watched the whole exchange. "That was your paycheck lipstick." "I know." Melissa smiled, tucking the dollar bill into the register. She'd make up the $1.50 difference from her own purse before she left. "But you should have seen her face." "You're going to be a really good teacher," Lisa said quietly. "Those kids are going to be so lucky." Melissa felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them away. 13 more months of saving. Then Del Mar in the fall. Then student teaching. Then... She gestured vaguely at the future, at all the classrooms full of children she'd help, all the little girls who needed someone to believe in them. "Then you change the world, one kid at a time," Lisa finished. "One kid at a time," Melissa agreed. At 6 o'clock exactly, Melissa clocked out, initialing the time card that showed she'd worked 42 hours that week. She changed out of her work flats, patent leather that made her feet ache, and into her comfortable canvas sneakers, stuffing the work shoes into a paper shopping bag along with her paperback novel. Her purse, a brown vinyl shoulder bag her mother had given her for Christmas, contained the usual: her wallet with $23, her apartment keys on a ring with a small plastic daisy, a compact mirror, 2 tubes of lipstick, a pack of Wrigley's spearmint gum, and the letter from Del Mar College confirming her enrollment for fall semester classes. She waved goodbye to Mr. Peterson, the store manager, who was helping a customer at the cash register. Lisa had already left through the front entrance. Melissa headed for the back, through the storage room that smelled of cardboard and floor wax, past the loading dock where delivery trucks dropped off merchandise. The door opened onto 4th Street, a quiet commercial block 3 streets back from the busier Chaparral. The bus stop was 3 blocks east, a straight shot down a sidewalk lined with live oak trees that provided sparse shade. Melissa made this walk 5 days a week. She knew every crack in the pavement, every storefront, every shortcut. She stepped into the brutal late afternoon heat and started walking. That was the last time anyone who knew Melissa Torres would see her alive. The disappearance. Rosa Torres knew something was wrong the moment 7 o'clock passed without Melissa walking through the door. Her daughter was never late. Not for work, not for dinner, not for Sunday Mass. It was one of the things Rosa loved and worried about in equal measure. Melissa's rigid sense of responsibility, as if she was trying to prove something to the world. By 7:30, Rosa stood on the front porch of their small house on Agnes Street, staring down the empty block as if she could will her daughter into existence. The sun was sinking toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Neighborhood kids played in the street, their shouts and laughter drifting through the humid air. Maybe she stopped at Lisa's house, Rosa's sister Eva suggested, though her voice held no conviction. She would have called. Rosa twisted her apron in her hands. She always calls. At 8 o'clock, Rosa called Woolworth's. Mr. Peterson answered, sounding irritated at being bothered after closing time. Yes, Melissa had left right at 6. No, he didn't know where she'd gone. She'd walked out through the back like she always did. At 8:30, Rosa called the police. Officer David Sullivan arrived at the Torres house at 9:15, notebook in hand, his uniform shirt showing dark patches of sweat despite the evening breeze. He was 31 years old, had been on the force for 7 years, and had never handled a missing persons case that turned out to be anything more than a teenager running away from home or a wife leaving her husband without warning. Rosa answered his questions in halting English, Eva translating when the words wouldn't come. Yes, Melissa had been acting normally. No, she didn't have a boyfriend. Not serious anyway, though there was a boy from church who sometimes talked to her after Sunday service. No, Melissa wouldn't just leave. She loved her job, was saving for college, called her mother every day without fail. She's probably with friends, Sullivan said, trying to sound reassuring. Young women that age, sometimes they lose track of time. My daughter is not like that, Rosa said quietly in Spanish, and Eva translated with an edge to her voice. You don't know Melissa. Sullivan promised to file a report, to check with the bus station and local hospitals, to call if he learned anything. He left the Torres house at 9:40, already convinced this would resolve itself by morning. He was wrong. At 6 a.m. the next morning, a sanitation worker named James Crawford was collecting trash from the dumpsters behind the shops on 4th Street when he noticed something lying near the loading dock of Woolworth's. A brown vinyl purse, its contents spilled across the concrete. He picked it up, saw the wallet with cash still inside, and immediately flagged down a passing patrol car. By 7 a.m., Detective Frank Morrison was standing behind Woolworth's, studying the scene with growing concern. The purse hadn't been there when the store closed at 9 p.m. the previous night. The night custodian had swept the loading dock and would have noticed it. Someone had placed it here between midnight and 6 a.m. Or someone had hidden it elsewhere and only moved it during the night. Morrison was 45, a 22-year veteran of the Corpus Christi Police Department, and he'd worked enough cases to recognize when something felt deliberately wrong. The purse wasn't robbed. The cash was intact. The items weren't scattered randomly. They were laid out almost carefully, as if arranged for someone to find. The paper shopping bag with Melissa's work shoes and her novel was never found. 3 days of intensive searching revealed nothing. Police canvassed the entire route from Woolworth's to the bus stop, interviewed every shopkeeper and resident, checked every alley and vacant building. Volunteers from St. Mary's Catholic Church, where the Torres family worshipped, searched the beaches along Corpus Christi Bay, the parks, the drainage ditches. Nothing. Melissa Torres had simply vanished, leaving behind only a carefully placed purse and a family that would spend the next 49 years waiting for answers. The investigation stalls. Detective Morrison worked Melissa's case for 3 months before the leads dried up completely. He interviewed everyone at Woolworth's. Mr. Peterson, the manager, remembered nothing unusual about that day. Lisa Martinez had left 5 minutes before Melissa and had taken the bus straight home. The other employees had clocked out at different times, all accounted for. No one remembered seeing Melissa leave. The boy from church, Daniel Vasquez, had an airtight alibi. He'd been working a double shift at his father's garage, with a half-dozen witnesses. He seemed genuinely devastated by Melissa's disappearance, but Morrison's instincts told him the young man knew nothing. The bus driver on the 4th Street route that evening didn't remember seeing Melissa. None of the other regular passengers recalled her boarding. The stores along her route had already closed by 6 p.m. on a Friday. The street had been essentially deserted. Morrison checked known sex offenders in the area. He investigated recent releases from prison. He reviewed every similar case in South Texas from the past decade, looking for patterns. Nothing connected. The photograph haunted him. It had been taken at a church picnic 2 months before Melissa disappeared, and someone had submitted it to the Corpus Christi Caller-Times when they ran a front-page story about her disappearance. Melissa stood in the center, smiling, her arm around her mother. To her right stood Father Miguel Hernandez, the priest from St. Mary's, his hand raised in a friendly wave. To her left, Lisa Martinez. Behind them, slightly out of focus, stood several other church volunteers helping set up tables for the picnic. Morrison stared at that photograph for hours, convinced it held some answer he wasn't seeing. Everyone in it had been interviewed. Everyone had alibis. Everyone had passed polygraph tests. Even Father Hernandez, who'd volunteered to take one just to eliminate any questions. By October 1974, the case had gone cold. Morrison kept the file on his desk for another year, pulling it out during slow moments, reading through the witness statements again and again. But without new evidence, without leads, there was nothing more he could do. There was one moment, though, that haunted him for the rest of his life. 3 months into the investigation, Morrison had called a meeting of every officer who'd been involved in the search. He wanted fresh eyes, wanted someone to see something he'd missed. 20 officers crowded into the conference room, including the patrol officers who'd helped with the initial canvassing. David Sullivan sat in the back row, quiet as always. Morrison had always liked Sullivan. Solid guy, reliable, showed up when you needed him. During the meeting, Morrison put up the church picnic photograph on the projector, asking if anyone recognized all the faces, if anyone knew of connections they'd missed. "That's me," Sullivan had said, pointing to his blurry figure in the background. "I volunteer sometimes. Helped set up tables that day." "You know the Torres family well?" Morrison had asked. Sullivan had hesitated. Just a fraction of a second, barely noticeable. "No, not really. I see them at services, that's all." Morrison had nodded and moved on, but later, reviewing his notes, he'd circled that exchange. Something about it felt off. The hesitation, the careful phrasing. He'd made a mental note to follow up, to ask Sullivan more questions about what he'd seen at church, who Melissa had talked to, if he'd noticed anything unusual. But then, 2 gang shootings happened in the same week, and a kidnapping case went hot, and Morrison got pulled onto a joint task force with the DEA. The follow-up with Sullivan slipped through the cracks, forgotten in the chaos of active cases that demanded immediate attention. 34 years later, in 2008, Frank Morrison lay in a hospital bed dying of pancreatic cancer. His son sat beside him, holding his hand, when Morrison suddenly gripped back hard. "The photograph," he whispered. "Check Sullivan. Church photograph." Something was wrong. His son, confused, had promised he would. But Morrison died that night, and his son, grief-stricken and overwhelmed with funeral arrangements, had forgotten until years later when he found his father's old notes while cleaning out storage. By then, it was 2015, and he had no idea which Sullivan his father had meant, or which case, or why it had mattered. He'd put the notes back in the box and returned it to storage, where they sat for another 8 years, when Detective Ortiz called him in 2023 to tell him about the DNA match, to tell him that David Sullivan had confessed to killing Melissa Torres. Morrison's son had gone silent on the phone. "My father knew," he finally said, his voice breaking. "He knew something was wrong. He told me on his deathbed, and I forgot. I fucking forgot." "You couldn't have known," Ortiz said gently. "He carried that case for 40 years, Morrison's son said. It ate at him, and he figured it out at the end. He figured it out, and I didn't listen." Ortiz thought about that conversation often in the months that followed. How close Morrison had come. How a single follow-up question might have changed everything. How Sullivan might have cracked under direct questioning in 1974, might have confessed before the warehouse was renovated, before Melissa's body was sealed under concrete for 5 decades. But she also thought about what Morrison's son had said when they spoke again after Sullivan's sentencing. "My dad used to say the job was about persistence, that you keep working, keep looking, keep asking questions. He didn't solve it, but maybe his instincts helped you solve it. Maybe that's enough." Maybe it was. Rosa Torres never stopped searching. She kept Melissa's room exactly as it had been. The bed made, the books on the shelf, the collection of ceramic angels on the dresser. Every Sunday after Mass, she lit a candle for her daughter. Every July 12th, Melissa's birthday, she made tres leches cake, her daughter's favorite, and sat alone in the kitchen eating a single slice while tears ran down her face. Detective Frank Morrison retired in 1992, 18 years after Melissa Torres disappeared. He carried the guilt of her unsolved case with him, the photograph from the church picnic tucked in his wallet, until the day he died in 2016. He never knew he'd been looking at the answer all along. A new generation detective, Carmen Ortiz, hadn't even been born when Melissa Torres disappeared. She came to the case fresh, unburdened by the frustrations and dead ends that had haunted Frank Morrison. In early 2023, Ortiz had taken on a personal project, digitizing and reviewing every cold case file from the 1970s stored in the department's basement archives. The paper files were deteriorating, some moldy from a leak that had gone undetected for months. She'd already reviewed 63 cases when she opened the Torres file and saw that same church picnic photograph. There was something about it that drew her attention. Maybe it was the way Melissa smiled at the camera, genuine happiness, no hint of the tragedy coming. Maybe it was Rosa Torres's protective arm around her daughter's shoulder. Maybe it was just intuition, the kind detectives develop after years of looking at evidence that doesn't quite fit. Ortiz ordered the physical evidence boxes from storage. Most of the items had degraded beyond usefulness. The purse had been tested for fingerprints in 1974, but the technology then was primitive. The cigarette butts found near the loading dock had been collected, but never processed. DNA analysis didn't exist yet. What if we ran everything through modern testing? Ortiz asked her sergeant one afternoon. The cigarette butts, any fabric samples, anything with potential biological material. "You know how backed up the lab is," Sergeant Martinez said. "These cases are 40, 50 years old. Nobody's going to prioritize." "Someone's mother is still alive," Ortiz interrupted quietly. "Rosa Torres. She's 91 years old. She should know what happened to her daughter before she dies." Something in her voice must have reached Martinez, because he sighed and nodded. "Submit what you've got. I'll put in a request to bump it up the priority list." The cigarette butts went to the lab in April 2023. The DNA extraction process took 3 months. Genetic material that old required special techniques, careful handling, multiple attempts. But in July, the lab called with results. They had a viable DNA profile from epithelial cells on one of the cigarette filters. Male. Complete enough to run through CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system. No match in CODIS. But there was another option. Genetic genealogy had revolutionized cold case investigations. By uploading DNA profiles to public genealogy databases like GEDmatch, investigators could identify distant relatives of unknown suspects and then build family trees to narrow down potential matches. Ortiz uploaded the profile on July 18, 2023, 49 years almost to the day since Melissa Torres disappeared. The results came back on August 3rd, 17 potential genetic relatives, ranging from 3rd to 5th cousins. Ortiz felt her pulse quicken as she began the painstaking work of building family trees, following birth records and marriage certificates and census data. 3 weeks later, she had it narrowed down to 3 possible individuals who would have been in Corpus Christi in 1974. 2 were deceased. The 3rd was 73 years old and living in a retirement community in Portland, Oregon. His name was David Sullivan. The photograph speaks. Ortiz pulled David Sullivan's personnel file from archived records. He'd been a police officer from 1967 to 1982, working patrol for his entire career. Divorced in 1980. No children. Moved to Oregon in 1983 and worked private security until retirement. His employment photo from 1974 showed a man in his early 30s, dark hair, average build, unremarkable in every way. The kind of face that blended into crowds. Ortiz went back to the Torres case file and found his name in the initial missing persons report. Officer David Sullivan, badge number 342, had responded to Rosa Torres's call at 9:15 p.m. on July 12, 1974. He'd filed the report, conducted the initial interview, promised to follow up. He'd also been among the officers who searched the area behind Woolworth's after the purse was discovered. He'd walked the route to the bus stop multiple times during the investigation. He'd attended the command briefings where Detective Morrison outlined the case's progress. He'd been part of the search, part of the investigation, part of the effort to find Melissa Torres. And he'd been there all along in that church picnic photograph. Ortiz pulled the image up on her computer screen and zoomed in on the background figures, the ones slightly out of focus. There, behind Father Hernandez, helping to carry a folding table, a younger version of David Sullivan in civilian clothes. He'd known Melissa. Not well, perhaps, but he'd been part of her church community. He would have seen her at Sunday services, at church events, at the very picnic where this photograph was taken. And 2 months later, when she disappeared, he'd been the first officer on the scene. He'd taken the report from her mother. He'd helped search for her. He'd known exactly where to look, because he'd known exactly where she was. Ortiz felt cold despite the August heat. She pulled every document that mentioned Sullivan, every report he'd filed, every note in the margins. The purse had been discovered at 6:45 a.m. by the sanitation worker. Sullivan had been one of the first officers to respond to that call, arriving at 7:15 a.m., before Detective Morrison, before the crime scene team, before anyone else. He'd been in the perfect position to discover evidence he'd placed himself, to contaminate the scene, to ensure the investigation looked in the wrong directions. On September 15, 2023, Ortiz boarded a plane to Portland. The arrest. David Sullivan lived in a small one-bedroom apartment in a retirement complex called Meadowbrook Gardens. The building smelled of pine-scented cleaning solution and the institutional cooking from the dining hall. Ortiz waited in the lobby with 2 Portland police detectives, watching residents shuffle past with walkers and canes. When Sullivan emerged from the elevator at 11 a.m., heading out for what the front desk clerk said was his daily walk to the nearby park, Ortiz stepped forward. "David Sullivan?" He looked at her with mild confusion, the expression of an old man interrupted during his routine. His hair was white, thinned to near transparency. His face carried deep lines and age spots. He wore a cardigan despite the mild Oregon weather and walked with a slight stoop. "Yes? I'm Detective Carmen Ortiz, Corpus Christi Police Department. I need to speak with you about Melissa Torres." For just an instant, less than a second, something flickered across Sullivan's face. Recognition, fear. Then it was gone, replaced by polite bewilderment. "I'm sorry, who?" "Melissa Torres. She disappeared in July 1974. You took the missing persons report from her mother." "That was nearly 50 years ago," Sullivan said slowly. "I worked hundreds of cases. I don't remember." "Your DNA was found at the scene," Ortiz said quietly. "We matched it through genetic genealogy. We have a warrant for your arrest, Mr. Sullivan." The old man's legs seemed to give out. He sat down heavily on a nearby bench, his hands trembling. One of the Portland detectives moved to stand beside him. "I need you to tell me what happened to Melissa Torres," Ortiz said, sitting down across from him. "Her mother is 91 years old. She deserves to know the truth before she dies." Sullivan stared at his hands for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I never meant to hurt her." The confession. They moved to an interview room at the Portland Police Bureau. Sullivan waived his right to an attorney, a decision that surprised Ortiz, but one she immediately documented on video. The confession took 6 hours. Sullivan spoke slowly at first, then faster, as if words held back for nearly 5 decades were finally breaking through a dam. He'd noticed Melissa at church services, he said. Not just noticed, fixated. She had a quality he couldn't name, something pure and hopeful that he'd lost somewhere along the way in his own life. His marriage was falling apart. His wife complained that he worked too much, came home smelling of cigarette smoke and cheap coffee, barely spoke to her anymore. He was 31 years old and felt ancient, worn down by seeing the worst of humanity on night patrols. Melissa seemed untouched by all that darkness. She smiled at everyone. She helped elderly ladies carry their groceries. She wore that silver charm bracelet that caught the light during church services, and he found himself staring at it, at her wrist, at the way she gestured when she talked. "I told myself I just wanted to get to know her," Sullivan said, his voice hollow. "That's what I told myself for weeks. I'd drive by Woolworths, just checking, making sure the area was safe. That's what I said, officer safety. But I was watching her, learning her routine, the time she left, the route she took. I knew she waited for the bus on 5th Street. I knew she carried her work shoes in a paper bag." He paused, staring at his hands. "The day it happened, I'd been sitting in my car for an hour. I kept starting the engine, telling myself to drive away. This was crazy. This was wrong. But then she walked out that back door, and I got out of the car. I approached her. Very friendly, very casual. "Hey, Melissa, right? From St. Mary's?" She smiled at me. That was the worst part. She smiled because she recognized me, Officer Sullivan, somebody safe. His voice cracked. I offered her a ride, said I was heading that direction anyway. She thanked me, but said no. The bus was fine. She was polite about it. So polite. And that should have been it. I should have said, "Okay, have a good evening," and driven away. But something in me just snapped. Or maybe it had been broken all along, and I was just finally admitting it. Ortiz watched him carefully. "What do you mean, snapped?" I grabbed her arm, not hard at first, just holding her there. And I said, "Please, just let me drive you home. We can talk." But she pulled away, and her purse fell. I heard it hit the pavement. And then she said, he stopped, his breathing uneven. She said, "Officer Sullivan, you're scaring me. Please let go." And the way she said it, like she was disappointed in me, like I'd failed some test I didn't even know I was taking. He covered his face with his hands. I grabbed her, covered her mouth, got her into my car. She fought. God, she fought so hard. Her fingernails scratched my arm. I wore long sleeves for 2 weeks after, even in that heat. I drove to my uncle's warehouse. The whole time she was crying, begging me to let her go, saying she wouldn't tell anyone, calling me by name. "Officer Sullivan, please. Officer Sullivan, I won't tell. Officer Sullivan, my mother's waiting for me." Ortiz felt cold. And then, Sullivan's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "I killed her. In the basement of that warehouse. It took longer than I expected. She kept struggling, kept trying to talk even when she couldn't breathe. And when she finally stopped, I just sat there on the dirty floor next to her body and thought, what have I done? What the fuck have I done?" He looked up at Ortiz with red-rimmed eyes. "You want to know the worst part? The absolute worst part? I buried her, and then I went home and ate dinner. My wife had made pot roast. I sat at the table and ate pot roast and answered when she asked about my day. 'Fine,' I said, 'just fine.' And part of me believed it. Part of me had already started building the wall in my head, the compartment where I could put what I'd done and pretend it didn't exist. And when her mother called the police, Ortiz asked. Sullivan almost laughed, a sound with no humor in it. I volunteered to take the call, actually volunteered, because I thought, I don't know what I thought. Maybe that being part of the investigation would make me feel less guilty. Maybe I thought I could control the narrative, make sure they didn't look too hard in the right places. Or maybe, he trailed off. Maybe what? Maybe I wanted to be caught. Maybe I thought if I was close enough to the investigation, someone would see it in my eyes. Someone would know. But nobody did. I sat in Mrs. Torres's living room and took her statement, and she looked at me with so much hope. "Please find my daughter," she said. "Please bring her home." And I said, "Ma'am, we'll do everything we can." And I meant it. In that moment, I actually meant it. Ortiz leaned forward. "What do you mean you meant it?" Sullivan's hands trembled. I started actually trying to help find her, not to throw off suspicion. I mean, yes, that was part of it, but also because maybe if I worked hard enough, if I searched long enough, it would somehow undo what I'd done. Magical thinking. Insane. But I'd be out there searching dumpsters and asking witnesses if they'd seen anything, and part of me was genuinely hoping we'd find her alive somehow, even though I knew exactly where she was. You placed her purse behind Woolworth's a week later. I couldn't figure out what to do with it, Sullivan said. It was in my trunk, just sitting there. Every time I opened the trunk, there it was. Her wallet, her keys, her ID with her smiling face. I thought about throwing it in the bay, but what if someone saw me? I thought about burning it, but what if a neighbor smelled it? So finally, I put it where it would be found, made it look like a robbery gone wrong. Maybe she'd gotten into someone's car, they'd robbed her, dumped the purse. Let the investigation focus on that. And it did. And it did, Sullivan echoed. Morrison. Detective Morrison. He was a good cop. Really good. He worked that case for months. And I helped. I actually helped. I gave suggestions. I checked leads. I interviewed witnesses. And every single time I did something to help the investigation, I'd think, this is penance. This is how I make it right. But you can't make murder right. There's no amount of good work that balances that scale. Ortiz studied him. Why didn't you turn yourself in? Sullivan was quiet for a long moment. Fear, selfishness, cowardice. Pick one. All of them. I'd think about it, especially after my wife left me, after I moved to Oregon, after I retired. I'd wake up at 3 a.m. and think, today's the day. Today I'll call the Corpus Christi police and tell them what I did. But then morning would come, and I'd make coffee, and I'd tell myself, what good would it do now? Melissa's dead. Nothing brings her back. Why destroy my life too? Selfish. Utterly selfish. He looked directly at Ortiz. When you walked up to me in that lobby, I felt relief. Actual relief. Because it was finally over. I didn't have to carry it alone anymore. I didn't have to wake up every morning and decide not to confess. The decision had been made for me. Does that make sense? No, Ortiz said coldly. It doesn't. You had 49 years to make this right. You chose yourself every single day. Sullivan nodded slowly. You're right. You're absolutely right. And that's something I'll have to live with for whatever time I have left. Not the murder. I've lived with that. But the cowardice. The fact that I let Mrs. Torres sit in that house for 49 years, not knowing, and I never had the courage to tell her the truth. He leaned back in his chair, looking suddenly much older than his 73 years. I used to go to that park bench every day and think about Melissa. I'd imagine her living the life she should have lived, becoming a teacher, getting married, having kids, growing old. And I'd think about all the children she would have taught, all the lives she would have touched, hundreds of kids, maybe thousands over a career, all of them robbed of her kindness because I couldn't control myself for 5 minutes. His voice broke completely. I took everything from her, and I took it from all those children who never got to have her as their teacher, and I took it from her mother, who died a little bit every day for 49 years. And for what? Because I was lonely? Because I was pathetic? Because I convinced myself I deserved something I had no right to? Ortiz let the silence stretch. Then she leaned forward. Where exactly did you bury her in that warehouse basement? And Sullivan told her. Every detail. The depth of the grave, the corner of the building, the way he'd scattered dirt over the disturbed earth, the wooden beam he'd used as a landmark so he'd always know where she was, though he'd never returned to that warehouse after 1976, when his uncle sold it for renovation. He told her everything, and in the telling, Ortiz heard not redemption, but the final unburdening of a man who'd carried a corpse in his soul for nearly half a century, and was finally, impossibly, setting it down. The recovery, the excavation of Melissa Torres's remains took 5 days. The forensic team worked with archaeological precision, carefully removing decades of concrete and earth, documenting every layer, preserving every fragment. What they found confirmed Sullivan's confession in heartbreaking detail. The bones showed evidence of strangulation, damage to the hyoid bone consistent with manual compression of the throat. Melissa's silver charm bracelet, tarnished but intact, still circled the bones of her left wrist. Fragments of fabric, faded beyond any recognizable color, were tested and found to match the cotton-polyester blend used in women's clothing in the mid-1970s. Most devastating was the small leather shoe found near the remains. Size 6. A canvas sneaker, the brand name barely visible. Keds. The twin to the shoe Rosa Torres had kept in Melissa's closet for 49 years, unable to part with even this small remnant of her daughter. On October 3, 2023, Ortiz called Rosa Torres. The old woman answered the phone in Spanish, her voice thin with age but still steady. Ortiz had learned enough Spanish growing up in Corpus Christi to deliver the news in Rosa's native language. "Señora Torres, we found Melissa. We found your daughter." The silence on the other end lasted so long, Ortiz worried the connection had dropped. Then came a sound that broke Ortiz's professional composure, a sob that carried 49 years of grief, relief, and unbearable loss all at once. "Where was she?" Rosa whispered. "Where was my baby all this time?" Ortiz told her. Not everything, not the details that would serve no purpose except to cause more pain, but enough. The warehouse, the concrete, the man who'd been a police officer who'd stood in Rosa's living room that first night and promised to find Melissa. "I want to see her," Rosa said. "I want to bring my daughter home." The trial. David Sullivan was extradited to Texas in November 2023. He appeared before Judge Patricia Martinez in Nueces County Court on January 15, 2024, entering a plea of guilty to one count of first-degree murder. The courtroom was packed. Corpus Christi media had followed the case extensively, and the story had gained national attention. A cop who'd murdered a young woman and then helped search for her body, who'd hidden in plain sight for nearly 5 decades before genetic genealogy finally identified him. Rosa Torres sat in the front row, flanked by her sister Ava and by Melissa's childhood friend Lisa Martinez, now a grandmother herself. Rosa wore black, her hands clutching a rosary worn smooth from decades of prayer. The prosecution called Detective Carmen Ortiz to walk the court through the investigation. She presented the DNA evidence, the confession, the physical evidence recovered from the warehouse. She showed the church picnic photograph, zooming in on Sullivan's younger face in the background, mere feet from the woman he would kill 2 months later. Sullivan's attorney, a public defender named Marcus Webb, who looked exhausted before the proceedings even began, offered no defense beyond his client's age and his clean record for the past 49 years. He argued for leniency, for acknowledgement that Sullivan had lived with guilt every day, that he'd cooperated fully once confronted. Judge Martinez's expression throughout suggested she found these arguments unconvincing. When given the opportunity to address the court, Sullivan stood with difficulty, leaning heavily on the defense table. He looked at Rosa Torres for a long moment, then looked away. "I can't ask for forgiveness," he said, his voice barely audible. "I know there's no forgiveness for what I did. I stole your daughter. I stole her future, her dreams, everything she should have been. And then I lied about it for 49 years. I wore a badge and pretended to search for her, knowing exactly where she was." He paused, swaying slightly. "I thought about turning myself in 1,000 times. I thought about it every birthday she would have had, every Christmas, every time I saw a young woman who looked like her. But I was a coward. I've always been a coward. Rosa Torres stood up. Ava reached for her arm, but Rosa gently pulled away and took 3 steps toward Sullivan. You took my baby, she said in Spanish, her voice steady despite the tears on her face. Eva translated into English for the court. You took my only child. You stole 49 years of my life. Every night I went to sleep wondering where she was, if she was suffering, if she was alone. You knew, and you said nothing. She pulled a photograph from her purse, the same church picnic photo, worn from being carried for decades. I prayed for you, Rosa continued. The man who took my Melissa. I prayed you would know guilt, that you would confess, that God would bring justice. I prayed for this day. But now that it's here, I find I don't have hatred anymore. Just sadness. For Melissa. For all the years she didn't get to live. She turned to Judge Martinez. Do what is right, she said simply. The verdict Judge Martinez sentenced David Sullivan to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At 73 years old, with multiple health conditions including diabetes and heart disease, it was effectively a death sentence. He would die behind bars, likely within a few years. But before that, there was one more thing Rosa Torres needed. Coming home. Melissa Torres's funeral took place on February 14, 2024, Valentine's Day, a date Rosa chose deliberately. She loved that day, Rosa told Father Miguel, now retired but still active at St. Mary's. She believed in love, in romance, in happy endings. I want her to rest on a day of love. The church was full. Not just family and the handful of Melissa's childhood friends who still lived in Corpus Christi, but strangers who'd followed the case. Young women who saw in Melissa's story a reminder of their own vulnerability, their own close calls with danger. Parents who understood Rosa's decades of not knowing. People who simply believed that bearing witness mattered. The casket was closed. After 49 years, there was nothing left that resembled the vibrant young woman in the photographs displayed around the church. But Rosa had placed items inside. Melissa's favorite dress, kept in tissue paper all these years. The romance novel she'd been saving to give Melissa for Christmas 1974. A letter Rosa had written but never sent. 49 years of words to a daughter who couldn't read them. Detective Carmen Ortiz attended in civilian clothes, standing in the back. She'd insisted she wasn't family, wasn't even a friend, but Rosa had personally invited her. You brought my baby home, Rosa had said. You gave me what I needed most, the truth. That makes you family. At the graveside in Seaside Memorial Park, with the Gulf Coast wind carrying the smell of salt water, Rosa placed a single red rose on the casket. I'll see you soon, mija, she whispered. Your mama's coming. Not today, but soon, and we'll have so much to talk about. Justice delayed. David Sullivan died in the medical unit of Texas Department of Criminal Justice's Estelle Unit on March 3, 2024, less than 2 months after his sentencing. Heart attack, the official report said. Quick, probably painless. Rosa Torres felt nothing when Detective Ortiz called to tell her. Not relief, not satisfaction, not even sadness. Just a kind of emptiness, as if a weight she'd carried so long had been removed, leaving her off balance in its absence. It's over, Ortiz said gently. No, Rosa replied. It ended 49 years ago, the night he took her. This is just the last chapter being written. She thanked Ortiz for calling and hung up. That evening, Rosa sat in Melissa's room. Now, finally, painfully, just a room, not a shrine, and packed away her daughter's things. The ceramic angels went into a box marked for donation. The books went to the library. The clothes, preserved in plastic garment bags, went to charity. She kept 3 items, the mate to the canvas sneaker found with Melissa's remains, the church picnic photograph, and the letter of acceptance from Del Mar College that had arrived a week after Melissa disappeared, congratulating her on her enrollment for the fall 1974 semester. These went into a cedar box that would eventually, Rosa knew, pass to Eva's daughter. Someone should remember Melissa as more than a victim, more than a cold case. Someone should remember the girl who dreamed of teaching, who believed in romance novels, who made tres leches cake with her mother on Sunday afternoons. Epilogue, Spring 2024. On March 15, 2024, Corpus Christi City Council unanimously voted to create the Melissa Torres Memorial Scholarship Fund, providing financial assistance to young women pursuing education degrees at Texas colleges. The first scholarship, in the amount of $5,000, was awarded to Maria Gonzalez, a 22-year-old woman from the same neighborhood where Melissa had grown up, who dreamed of teaching elementary school. Rosa Torres attended the award ceremony at City Hall. She'd asked Detective Ortiz to drive her, uncertain if her legs would hold her through the event. At 92, every public appearance felt like it might be her last. The council chambers were full. Local news cameras lined the back wall. Mayor Christine Ramirez gave a speech about community memory and second chances and the power of education. Rosa heard the words without really listening. She was looking at Maria Gonzalez, standing at the podium in a dress that was probably borrowed, her hands trembling slightly as she held her acceptance letter. When it was Rosa's turn to present the scholarship check, she stood with effort. Ortiz moved to help her, but Rosa waved her away. This she needed to do alone. She walked to the podium slowly, each step deliberate. Maria met her there, and Rosa took both of the young woman's hands in hers. Up close, Maria looked nothing like Melissa. Her face was rounder, her eyes lighter brown, her hair shorter, but something in her expression, an eagerness, a determination, a kind of fierce hope, that was Melissa. That was exactly Melissa. "My daughter never got to teach," Rosa said, her voice stronger than she'd expected. She spoke in Spanish, and Maria answered in the same language, both women understanding that some truths required their mother tongue. "I know," Maria said softly. "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry." Rosa squeezed her hands. "Be everything she would have been. Be the teacher she dreamed of becoming. Love your students the way she would have loved them. And when you have a little girl in your classroom who's struggling, who comes from nothing, who thinks she's not smart enough or good enough," Rosa's voice caught. "You tell that little girl she can do anything. You tell her because Melissa can't." Tears ran down Maria's face. "I promise. I swear to you. I promise." Rosa pulled her close, this girl she'd never met before today, and held her the way she'd held Melissa 1,000 times. For just a moment, with her eyes closed, she could pretend. She could pretend her daughter had lived, had achieved her dreams, had become the teacher she was meant to be. When she pulled back, Rosa reached into her purse and took out something small wrapped in tissue paper. She pressed it into Maria's hand. This was Melissa's. She wore it every day. Maria unwrapped it carefully. Inside was the silver charm bracelet, cleaned, polished, some of the charms carefully repaired where time had damaged them. The tiny book, the cross, the heart, the star, the schoolhouse. "I can't," Maria started. "You can," Rosa interrupted. "You will. You'll wear it when you teach. You'll wear it when you stand in front of your first classroom. And you'll remember that you're not just teaching for yourself. You're teaching for every girl who didn't get the chance." Maria closed her fingers around the bracelet, and Rosa saw her lips move in what might have been a prayer or a promise. The ceremony continued. There were more speeches, more applause, more photos for the newspaper. But Rosa returned to her seat, feeling something she hadn't felt in 49 years. Not peace, exactly, but something close to it. Something like completion. Outside, in the parking lot, Ortiz helped Rosa into the car. "That was a beautiful thing you did," Ortiz said, giving her the bracelet. "Melissa would have wanted it," Rosa replied. "She would have wanted to help that girl. So now she will." She looked out the window at the city that had taken her daughter, that had hidden the truth for half a century, that was now trying, in its small way, to make amends. "You know what I realized?" Rosa said quietly. "Sullivan took 49 years from me. He took my daughter, my peace, my happiness. But he didn't take her purpose. Maria will teach because of Melissa. Other girls will learn because of Melissa. That scholarship will help women for generations, and every single one of them will carry a piece of my daughter with them." She turned to look at Ortiz. He thought he won. For 49 years, he thought he got away with it, thought he erased her. But you can't erase people by killing them. Their love spreads. Their influence grows. Melissa is more alive now, touching more lives through that scholarship than she ever could have been if she'd just lived quietly and taught in one small school. "You really believe that?" Ortiz asked. Rosa was quiet for a moment. "I have to. Because if I don't believe her death meant something, then what was the point of any of it? What was the point of waiting? What was the point of all those prayers?" Ortiz started the car but didn't pull out of the parking space. She needed to say something, had been trying to find the words for weeks. "Mrs. Torres, I want you to know. Working your daughter's case changed me. I've worked a lot of investigations. I'll work more. But I'll never forget Melissa. I'll never forget you. And every time I open a cold case file, every time I look at evidence that everyone else has given up on, I'll remember that somewhere there's a mother waiting, and that mother deserves the truth." Rosa reached over and patted Ortiz's hand. "You're a good detective. Melissa would have liked you. I wish I could have known her." "You did," Rosa said simply. "You brought her home. That's the most important way to know someone, to care enough to bring them home." They drove back to Rosa's house in comfortable silence. When they arrived, Rosa didn't get out right away. "I won't be here much longer," she said matter-of-factly. "My heart is tired. My body is tired. But now I can rest. I know where she is. I know what happened. I know justice was done. That's all I needed." "Mrs. Torres—" "Don't," Rosa interrupted gently. "Don't say I have years left or that I'm strong. I've been strong for 49 years. I'm tired of being strong. I want to rest now. I want to see my daughter again and tell her about Maria, about the scholarship, about how her story helped so many others. That's what I want." She got out of the car slowly, waved once, and walked to her front door. Ortiz watched her go inside, watched the light come on in the front window, watched the curtain move as Rosa looked out one last time. 3 months later, Rosa Torres died peacefully in her sleep. She was found in Melissa's room, no longer a shrine, but a quiet space where Rosa had moved a small bed and spent her final nights surrounded by the photographs and memories of her daughter. On her nightstand, investigators found a letter addressed to Maria Gonzalez. In it, Rosa wrote, "You asked me at the ceremony how I survived 49 years of not knowing. I want to tell you the truth. I didn't survive. Part of me died the night Melissa disappeared. But here's what I learned. We can die and still keep living. We can be broken and still hold together. We can lose everything and still find purpose. You wear that bracelet now. You carry Melissa with you. And every child you teach, every life you touch, that's my daughter living again. That's my daughter being the teacher she dreamed of being. Don't cry for me when I'm gone. Don't feel sad. I got what I needed, the truth, justice, and the knowledge that Melissa's story didn't end in a warehouse basement. It ended in you, in your classroom, in all the children you'll help. That's how we defeat people like Sullivan, not by hating them, but by making sure the people they killed still manage, somehow, to change the world. Thank you for being Melissa's hands. Thank you for being her voice. Thank you for teaching in her name. With love and gratitude, Rosa Torres. Maria Gonzalez read that letter at Rosa's funeral. She read it standing at the podium in St. Mary's Catholic Church, wearing the silver charm bracelet, her voice breaking but never stopping. She read it in Spanish and then in English, so everyone could understand. And when she finished, she looked out at the crowded church, at Ortiz sitting in the third row, at Eva and her family, at the city council members who'd created the scholarship, at the reporters who'd followed the case, at the students from Maria's education program who'd come to pay respects to a woman they'd never met. And she said, I'm going to teach for 50 years, and every single day, I'm going to remember why I'm there. For Melissa, for Rosa, for every girl who deserves a chance to become who she's meant to be. She touched the bracelet on her wrist. Sullivan took 49 years, but we're going to give back 50, and then another 50 after that, and another after that. That's how we win. In the front pew, Detective Carmen Ortiz closed her eyes and let herself cry for the first time since she'd opened the Torres case file 18 months earlier. She cried for Melissa, who'd dreamed of teaching. She cried for Rosa, who'd waited half a century for truth. She cried for Morrison, who'd known something was wrong but died before he could prove it. But mostly, she cried because justice, real justice, wasn't about arrests and confessions and prison sentences. It was about this: a young woman wearing a bracelet, promising to teach for 50 years, carrying forward the dream of someone she'd never met. That was justice. That was what made the work matter. Outside the church, the Gulf Coast wind carried the smell of salt water. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, the same colors that had hung in the sky the night Melissa Torres walked out the back door of Woolworth's and into darkness. But this evening, in this moment, the sunset looked like hope. It looked like second chances. It looked like 50 years of children learning from a teacher who wore a silver bracelet and remembered, always, that she was teaching for two.